Hello, welcome to this new meeting of the PARC think tank on Eurofascism. Only in the morning we realized that the recording hadn't started from the beginning of our meeting. Therefore, this small clip as a replacement of the introduction of the speaker and of the first question. We are talking today, or yesterday, we were talking to Mr. Øyvind Strømmen, who is a freelance journalist from Norway, someone who is politically involved, an author of various books, for instance, on Hungary, conspiracy theories, Eurofascism, and he also wrote different books on the history of European extremism. Or extremism from the radical right. And he is mainly also an expert on extremism from radical groups, whether it be on the radical right or coming from religious groups. And Mr. Strømmen has been involved with these matters for a very long time. In 2011, he was awarded the award for freelance journalists in Norway, awarded by the Union of Journalists there, especially due to his comments and reporting of the events around the terror attacks in 2011 in Norway. And prior to these events, Mr. Strømmen had already warned for such a terror attack. And in an interesting fact is also that in 2012, Mr. Strømmen was invited as an expert during the trial of Anders Breivik. So someone who indeed is very interesting and who we wanted to talk with, especially after the election result in Germany. And it was also a bit of a coincidence that I came across his writings. I found this book on Eurofascism published in 2007 in my university library. And while I was scanning its pages and reading through it, I realized how relevant the book and everything inside still is for today. And that really struck me, and that was a reason to reach out to Mr. Strømmen, and he was kind enough to accept our invitation. And I asked a few questions, but the question I asked before the recording started was, on the last page of this book, he wrote in 2007, that's some 18 years ago. If this book was a human being, it was now able to vote. So that's really a long time ago. But on the last page of this book in 2007, he wrote, anyone concerned with the threat of totalitarian ideologies in today's Europe have every reason to worry. Is Mr. Strømmen more concerned now than he was back in 2007? Enjoy the rest of the meeting.
Well, it's a good question, and the answer is I'm afraid that I am more concerned, and the reason, of course, being developments in the world since 2007. I mean, for once, there are several developments that are worth mentioning, and one thing is the growth of the far right, but there are also other threats towards liberal democracy that we see are very strong today, and that includes state actors. Now, obviously, one example is Russia. You could also mention China and the increasing role of China throughout the world. And then also the recent developments in the United States, and the fact that the United States seem to be heading towards a more authoritarian or semi-authoritarian system, and also seem to be heading in a way backwards in time to a different era where international relations were all about power, and where the United States do not seem to care as much about soft power approaches anymore, and also seem to be looking at international politics more like a zero-sum game, and consequently that also places Europe in a squeeze, and it places liberal democracy in a squeeze. So there are many developments that are to be frank, very worrisome. And when I look back at what I wrote in 2006, I think that there are some tendencies that have just increased.
And I think one of them is the rise in certain radical forms of thought and radical parties. You name it Eurofascism. Could you explain us a bit more about this phenomenon, or how you would call it?
Well, when I used that terminology back in 2006, 2007, it was also to contrast against what was much discussed at the time with extreme Islamism being referred to as Islamofascism. Now, I think that there are some limitations to how much sense that made, but at the same time, I thought it was important to draw attention to the fact that there are several radical right-wing political parties in Europe that do indeed have their historical roots in neo-fascist movements from the 1960s and 1970s. Now, of course, today that is just part of the radical right. I mean, if you look at different parties in different countries, you have to also be able to see the differences between them, and that they have different roots. But still, a party like the Rassemblement National today in France, they have specific roots back in the 60s and 70s in a neo-fascist movement, in a neo-fascist environment. If you look at Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy, although that could be described as a post-fascist party, it does still have specific roots in fascism. And if you look at Vlaams Belang in Flanders, it's the same thing. There are specific roots there. And I thought that that's important, because it's also important to talk about the ideological development that has taken place within fascism and within far-right thought after the Second World War. And that's why I used the term to really also point out that there is an ideological continuity. Of course, there's also been ideological development, but that it's important to actually place it within an historical context, and to understand the wider historical context and the wider ideological context. So that was the reason I used that term back then. Of course, today I might tend to talk about the radical right, also because it's a wider term that also allows us to look at different phenomena, such as the Alternative für Deutschland, for instance, which has a different kind of background, or to look at the party of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, which is also a different animal, but still part of the radical right.
You mentioned the continuities, and I'm wondering whether you think that people covering these groups nowadays, journalists, others, political commentators, are aware of these continuities.
Well, to a certain degree, they are. But at the same time, I think that there is often in coverage of the radical right, there's a lacking understanding of the different kinds of ideological movements that make up part of the radical right, and that give the radical right the ideas that it has today in various countries. And I think very often to get a deeper understanding of that, you have to go beyond the news media and really have to look into more academic works to be able to see that. So, for instance, I think that Peter Neumann in Germany published an excellent book a couple of years back, which discusses different ideological traditions that exist on the far right. And I think that if you want to understand what's going on in Germany, or what's going on in France, or for that matter, what's going on in the United States, I think it's important to look at those ideological traditions and to actually engage with it also from an academic point of view.
There is another question that just popped up on my mind, because you use both radical right and far right. Some people choose to use extreme right. You don't do that. Is there a specific thought behind it? Why you use certain terminology and not others?
Well, to a certain degree, I think I'm influenced by my own native language. I know that in certain other European languages, the word extreme is used in a wider meaning. So, for instance, in French, you might talk about Rassemblement National as a party of the extrême droite. Or in German, you might talk about extreme rechts also in a wider context. Now, in the Norwegian sense of the word, which of course colors how I'm using it, I think extremism kind of hints at an extra parliamentarian side, and it also hints at the use of violence or the support of violence. And while I do believe that there are violent ideas and violent rhetoric going around on the radical right, I think it's still helpful to differentiate between the forces that are engaging with parliamentary democracy and are working within parliamentary democracy, so to speak, and those who are really also viewing themselves not only as enemies of liberal democracy, but in fact as enemies of democracy itself. So that's why I tend to talk about the radical right and the extreme right as being two different categories, while the far right could be sort of an umbrella term.
Thank you for this detailed answer. You mentioned that there are, of course, differences in the languages we use, but we see the same phenomenon all over the continent in different forms, maybe with different rhetorics, but essentially the message seems the same. It's often very anti-immigrant. It's often also anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim. Not always, but there is a thin line that divides their rhetoric sometimes from these more worrying narratives. How come that so many different parties in different countries are on the rise at the same moment in Europe? Do you have an explanation for this?
I don't know if I have a good explanation for this because I think it's a difficult topic and it's difficult to find a sort of one size fits all explanation throughout Europe and also throughout the West. I mean, you can see it in other countries as well. Of course, there are some factors that I do think play a role. And one of them is there is in these parties there is this shared belief in sort of civilizational decay, that things are heading in the wrong direction, that our societies are under threat, so to speak, and that this threat is coming from immigration, but also from globalism in and of itself, and perhaps from sort of the homogenizing effect of global capitalism, and I think that those things play into they certainly play a factor in all of this when it's happening, and I think that when this is then combined with genuine political crisis, lack of confidence in democratic parties, and also in things financial, a more difficult financial situation, partly also a result of the war in Ukraine and inflation and an energy crisis and those things as a result of that war. I think that plays into the hand of those ideas of decay and that society is changing and that some of us are then left behind. And I think that very often the radical right has been quite successful at telling this a story to a considerable part of the electorate that they are the ones that are being left behind. They are the ones that are not being listened to by the political elites, etc., etc. And I think that story is quite powerful, and I think that story plays a role in many European contexts.
So you would say there is a form of like a decay or doomsday thinking, which also still is closely aligned to certain forms of conspiracy thinking. For instance, you mentioned Eurabia in your book, and maybe this whole idea of white replacement, the Kalergi plan, all of these narratives that are actually being strengthened by also the same politicians who are asking for these votes. So my question would be, do you think that all these hardships really exist? Or do you think that it mainly exists due to the narratives of the politicians who create them?
Well, it's a bit of both. I mean, one party conspiracy theories is absolutely part of this, and you could even say that it's part and parcel of it all. And the whole idea of the elite that is involved in some kind of dark conspiracy against us, against common people, against normal people. That is certainly part of it. And that idea is being promoted through alternative media and in channels that belong to radical right-wing forces and etc., etc., and from radical right-wing politicians. At the same time, however, I think that there is also there is some reality to it in the sense that there are people that feel that democracy have sort of left them behind. And I think that if you look at the electoral results of the radical right in various countries, you will often discover that the radical right-wing parties are stronger in areas that in some ways or the other could be seen as in the periphery. Not necessarily in a geographical periphery, but at least in the periphery of power. So I think, for instance, if you look at the recent election result now in Germany and AfD, you will see AfD, they did a very good election all over Germany, but in particular in the old East Germany. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that has to do with an actual sentiment of having been left behind by democracy, having been left behind by the development, having been left behind by modern society. And I think you can see some of the same tendencies in France. You can see some of the same in the Netherlands. You can see some of the same in a number of countries where also this role of being in the periphery plays into that narrative and into the ideas of the radical right. And I think personally, I mean, I think an important observation to make is that liberal democracy has enemies. And those enemies, they will not hesitate to use actual frustration or to use actual problems to draw voters to them, to draw support to them, and to weaken support for liberal democracy. They will certainly employ that, and that entails promoting conspiracy theories, but it also entails taking hold of real issues and real things that are provoking people or worrying people or alienating people.
It is, however, very rare that we see people identifying as someone who is an enemy of liberalism or democracy. They would often call themselves a liberal or even a conservative. They will label themselves in different ways, and this makes this disguise maybe makes it even harder for others to give the right labels. And then there's also the problem of calling everyone fascist, which also happens on the left side of the political spectrum. So, is there a way out of this what seems as a vicious circle?
I'm sorry to disrupt. I would like to also add something that what you ask. And you might aware one of the latest tweet of Elon Musk is telling that Europe is kind of fascism that is not allow freedom of speech. But at the same time, what he is doing to supporting the far right in Germany is exactly what you're asking. It's we don't know who is who. I mean, someone is promoting the freedom of speech. At the same time, to accusing someone is not enough Democrat, but on the other hand, supporting the far right. And it will be interesting what you think about this, Mr. Strömmen.
Well, I think that there is. I mean, first of all, there's certainly if you look at a radical left, and people on the radical left might also very well be against liberal democracy. But also people on the radical left have been using the term fascism too much too liberally, and and there is a risk to that because it also makes it more difficult to approach actual fascist ideology and the role of neo-fascist thinking into today's radical right. So that's part of it. Then when it comes to the sort of the paradox of people that are indeed attacking liberal democracy, that at the same time claim that they are defending freedom of speech, they are defending democracy. The latter is sometimes the case. They are defending a form of democracy, but it's not liberal democracy. And I think that one shouldn't underestimate the importance of someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary, for instance, talking about illiberal democracy and how they want to build something else, something new, something different than liberal democracy. And I think that it's become increasingly popular in the last few years, actually, on the radical right to also say this more or less outright, that they are indeed opposed to liberalism and to liberal globalism. And I think that's also clear from spokespeople of the Republican Party in the United States today. I think we can see that clearly from a party like in Austria, or from the AfD as well. And freedom of speech can then be used as a weapon. It can be weaponized as well. To point at what they see as sort of the Achilles heel, as it were, of liberal democracy, namely legislation against hate speech, etc., etc. At the same time, when you start looking at what they're actually doing, I mean, what's going on in the United States right now concerning attacks on academic freedom, concerning words that are being rooted out from government websites, etc. I mean, it doesn't look like they're defending freedom of speech to me. So I mean, this is once again, I mean, people that are envisioning something else than liberal democracy. They're envisioning some sort of other system, which might have or not have democratic sides to it, but they will not hesitate to use what they can in their criticism against liberal democracy. So if liberal democracy defends itself through hate speech legislation, then that will be used against it. If liberal democracy doesn't provide good enough answers in response to, say, the energy crisis, then that will be used against it. And I think that's very much going on at the moment. I think that's going on in country after country, and I think that that's one of the really worrying things that we see in today's world.
Thank you. I want to talk about a point you make in the book, because we touched it right now as well. Much too often, the task of defending these so-called Western values have simply also been left to others than you would expect, to different parties. The example you give is, for instance, feminist groups who have failed in attacking patriarchal structures amongst immigrant communities, immigrant structures, maybe different religions, and that this is one of the reasons why the narratives of others have become more acceptable. Can you expand a bit on this critique, maybe?
Yeah, once again, I think it has to do with how people that are against liberal democracy will also use whatever they can in their attacks on liberal democracy, and I think that if you have a situation where, for instance, people shy away from criticizing patriarchal views within Islam, or anti-gay ideas, or misogynistic ideas, and if people shy away from this in the fear of being seen as racist, or in the fear of enabling racist, then actually they are enabling racists, and I think that's a big paradox. Because of course groups that are very strong in their anti-immigration views, they will use examples like that. Just like they will use extreme Islamism as evidence for their stances and for the necessity of their policies. So, for instance, now in Munich, when there was a terrorist attack in Munich, that very much played into the hands of AfD. And if other political forces are not able to tackle those questions, are not able to give or offer answers on how to deal with, for instance, religious extremism, or political extremism with roots in the Middle East, then that will also be used as a tool, as a way of attacking liberal democracy from the radical right, because it sells. It's a very saleable argument, and it fits with their xenophobia, and it fits with the kind of it can also fit very well with theories that are essentially conspiracy theory narratives. So like the Eurabia theory, which of course was a bigger thing in some ways in 2006 than it is today, but also like the idea of the great replacement, which is perhaps the form that it takes more often today. Then it all comes back to the question that I'm often trying to raise, namely that we have to understand that there is that the far right exists as an ideological framework of its own. and that there are indeed different ideological traditions that belong on the far right, and that these traditions are also combined with relevant issues today, and of course they live in the same world as we do, so they will also try to explain the world, but they will do it from their ideological standpoint. And if we are not willing to see that, then I think that maybe we will be overlooking some of the attacks on liberal democracy that are taking place, and maybe also will be overlooking the necessity for other political forces to address issues that are indeed real issues, and that people are indeed concerned about.
Well, thank you very much for this clear explanation. Politicians in the Netherlands, especially some of the parties on the left wing, have asked for input on for a new story, for a new narrative, and I think that this might be a part of it. Also, the election results in Germany also clearly show that there is much need for a new narrative. We don't have that much time left. I will ask my last question, and maybe if Dr. Nevzet has a question as well, we can also quickly fit that into the question. But I was wondering what drives you to delve into these topics. Of course, you're a journalist, so it's also a professional thing that you're doing. But is it to know your adversary? Is it the fascination? How come that you are invested in it?
Oh, there are many explanations to that question, really. I mean, partly it is, of course, to know my adversary. I mean, I'm a firm believer in the benefits of liberal democracy, and I think that it's important for liberal Democrats to understand what they're up against. Partly it's also because I've always been interested in people that have other ideas. Why do they have other ideas, and where do these other ideas actually come from? From an academic perspective, perhaps. I mean, that makes me curious, and it makes me wanna know. So I've always been interested in actually looking into and reading their own material to try and understand where they're coming from. But also, I mean, what started me off and led to me starting working specifically on extremism and on the radical right, but also on other forms of radical ideas, was living in Belgium and witnessing right-wing extremism, also in the form of a terrorist plot. Back in 2005 or six, around there, and although I'm from Norway, I was living in Belgium at the time. That happened. Well, there was a number of razzias carried out by the police, and one of those razzias was in my own neighborhood. So that led me to have an interest in sort of the extremist side of the far right, and I started digging, and when I started digging in extremism, I also found that there were some things that were shared or some common roots with a wider far right scene, and that interested me, and it also scared me. So I'm thinking that's sort of where it started, my interest in the topic.
Very fascinating topics indeed. Thank you very much, Dr.
I have just maybe one more question, but shortly. It was really great to listen and learn a lot of your perspective on the topic. What do you think about future of European Union after all the rises of the far right and yeah, it's will continue, or if it continues, how it will continue?
I think right now it's very difficult to make any kind of it's very difficult to look into the crystal ball, as it were, because I think the world is changing. I think that the United States and the role of the United States is changing very much, and that might lead to the European Union being reinvigorated, and to people seeing more of a need for European cooperation, and perhaps also on areas where this has not been the case in the past. So more security cooperation, maybe even military cooperation. At the same time, of course, the radical right is growing in a number of European countries, and this might have a large impact on the development of Europe in the years to come. And I think today of course 2024 was a very good year for the radical right electorally in a number of countries. 2025 thus far we've seen some of the same, but is it going to continue? I don't know, and I think there as well it's a big question what's going to happen in the United States, and how is that going to be understood and interpreted in Europe. And I think that might have more of an impact than any of us can foresee at the moment. So it's we are living in interesting times, and some people have told me that that's a curse, but I think at least it's true. We are living in interesting times.
And let's end on that note. Thank you very much for this talk in interesting times.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting us, Doctor. And it was very great, and hope to see you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good evening.
Goeie avond.